Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're back here in the John Hope Franklin Center here at Duke University. And we are joined today by political scientist Candis Watts Smith, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She's the author of several books: Black Mosaic, The Politics of Black Pan-Ethnic Identity, published by NYU University Press in 2014. The co-author with Tahama Lopez Banyazi of Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter, also NYU University Press 2019. And the just published Racial Stasis, The Millennial Generation and the Stagnation of Racial Attitudes in American Politics, which is published by the University of Chicago Press. How are you doing today, Professor Watt?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It is so good to see you and to have you return here to your alma mater, Duke University.
It's a pleasure to be home.
Thank you. I want to read this quick quote from Robin Kelly about Stay Woke. He says, "Stay Woke lays bare the common sense assumptions that both sustain and obscure racism, makes it impossible for anyone to sleep on Black Lives Matter and the ongoing struggle to end racism as we know it." What I find really interesting about this book is that it's really a primer, right? It's a primer for Black Lives Matter, but also this particular moment of Black political struggle. Talk a little bit about why that was the option for the book.
Sure. So actually, NYU Press asked me to write a book about Black Lives Matter. And I did not want to come at it from the standpoint of a social scientist, mostly because I knew that I couldn't, the way that Black Lives Matter is set up is local, right? That they're local chapters. And so I said, well, if I'm going to write that book, I'm going to have to do a lot of traveling.
Right.
And I wouldn't be able to give it the nuance that it deserves.
Gotcha.
But what I can do is write a book about why we have this movement right now. And, in talking to my students, there are all these questions that they have, and on the one hand, they're like, well, we had a Black president, but now we have a movement that says that Black Lives Matter, and this just doesn't make sense. And so I asked Tahama to just, join me in trying to explain this to students, but also just to regular people who want to know more, who want to do better. So we came at it from the perspective of educators, right, to help our students get farther along that path that they're hoping to get on.
It's interesting because a lot of the work done on Black Lives Matter thus far, there's some sociology texts, a lot of personal texts, memoirist texts written by folks who are involved in the movement, a lot of great work on the way that the movement used social media, particularly Twitter. We haven't got a whole lot of stuff, I think, yet from the perspective of political scientists. So as a political scientist looking at this, what do you see when you saw Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, for me, I think that when we see it bubble up in the second term of the first Black president's, administration, is that people are like, wait a second. How is it that we are supposedly living in this post-racial world, but we also have all of these videos that is irrefutable evidence that Black lives don't matter? And so it just, for me, it shows how Black politics has always pushed the U.S. to see its flaws. And the flaws were easily obscured in a Obama, right? And so they're like, no, we're gonna take this off. We're gonna come out of the shadows here and show you things that you can't say is not signs of structural racism.
Do you think we see the same kind of political activity under a Romney presidency? Or was it that contradiction of these killings under Obama's presidency that really inspires some of the movement?
I think so. I mean, because you can't, I think it's kind of like, please don't say again, we have a Black president, what are you getting upset about, right? It's, in that moment, right, where these two are really there's a struggle between visions. I don't know if we would have seen that under a Romney presidency.
One of the interesting parts of the book, and I mentioned this to you beforehand, I'm teaching the book this semester, and the students were really struck with the conversations about terminology. And I think about even in some place like Duke, when students started throwing around words like microaggressions, and folks were like, what are you talking about? And part of the challenges, I think, of a movement like this, that's so text-driven, slogan-driven, you know, because it exists on a platform where you can only push out 240 words. Part of the challenge is finding a way to hold the language and the meaning in the language, but to also hold it in the same space for folks who you need to move their hearts and their minds, but they're never going to really understand the language. So talk a little bit about those struggles for Black Lives Matter and any movement really going forward.
So, I mean, a couple of things. One, I think that even not online, we talk past each other.
Yeah.
Right, so even just saying Black Lives Matter becomes an issue of contention. As a matter of fact, I was at a community meeting on Monday, and the director of equity for the school district comes to the community to say, we want to have a curriculum around Black Lives Matter at school. And the people who were there were police chiefs, ministers, business people, and they were like, well, isn't that anti-police? And so even here, right, we're talking past each other. The other thing, so there's that one thing, is like, can we get on the same page?
Right.
I think the other thing is that there's like a woker than Taoism sometimes, even among, right, among all sorts of people. Right. But to say, you know, they're like, my definition is the definition.
Right.
Like, let's have a conversation about how words change over time, how in different contexts they might mean different things, and how we might just need to have a conversation so that I know that the word that you're using is the word that I understand you to mean. Right? There's a lot of, even among people who might, let's say, allies, right, who would be on the same side, might have a very different view of a particular term, word, phrase, hashtag.
So how do you think about a phrase like white supremacy in this context? It almost just feels as though white supremacy has circulated in the last decade in ways that were, you know, previously unimaginable. Right? There's a way in which you can't even think about saying it publicly 50 years ago, but everybody has their own take on kind of white supremacy, and it feels like, I know for many whites, as a pejorative that shuts down conversation. So if you're a young activist, you know, how do you really reach folks around the impact of white supremacy as a system and not have whites hear that you're talking about how bad white people are?
Right. I mean, that's the exact conversation that we are trying to get people to have, is that it's not all about you. Right? I mean, so many people take everything personally. And the fact of the matter is that we all have the capacity, right, even the propensity to make decisions, to support policies, to rely on biases that reproduce white supremacy. But there's also a larger structure, right, that we call white supremacy, and it's not all about you. And so really just trying to guide people, on the one hand, it's like, take it personal because you have a responsibility, but also recognize that there are other things that don't even require your attention or intent to work, right, against equality, equity.
Some of the critics of Black Lives Matter, now we're talking 7 years ago, wasn't just white folks and police officers. You had very real critiques coming from the older guard of the civil rights movement, who talked about the inefficiency of a leaderless movement, who made critiques that the real work has to happen in the street and not sitting on your laptop or your handheld device, that wasn't really political movement. And some of the pushback, the clapback really, from the Black Lives Matter generation was that, you know, this is not your grandparents' civil rights movement. Now, some of that commentary was dismissive, right, in ways that suggested somehow the crisis that black folks faced 50, 70 years ago was less of a crisis, right, than what some young folks are dealing with now, or that somehow previous generations weren't as woke, right, as this generation, even though the actual term woke can be traced to Melvin Kelly in the 1960s. How do you, as a political scientist, and in the book, work through this divide between the old guard and the new guard? Where are the places where they actually do share a vision and practice about social justice, and where are the ways where they really kind of go in very different directions?
So I think that it's really important for us to think about the ways that we remember the civil rights movement and have been taught about the civil rights movement as, right, you never meet people who are like, I did not march with King, right? Everybody wants to say they marched with King. Right. But we also know that at that time, Martin Luther King Jr. had like a 30% approval rate. Right. And so we don't talk about the different attitudes that even black people had at that time. About King. Yeah. Right. We don't talk about anger. We don't talk about, right, people taking the street. You know, we talk about protest, and we talk about, you know, well-dressed teenagers at, you know, at Woolworths, right? But there was a gritty... And informal politics. That's right. And a local politics. Right? That we also kind of focus on one figure. Right? We all know Martin Luther King. And it's huge, particular, you know, social, whether it's Montgomery or Selma, right? So we remember Boston. Those, or Boston. Right. So we remember those moments, right? And so, I mean, so in that way, people are like, well, you guys aren't doing it right. And it's like, but you're not remembering right in some ways. Yeah. So I think, I mean, there's some commonalities that we refuse to see because we've romanticized the civil rights movement in a particular kind of way. But then on the other hand, right, so we know that there wasn't really necessarily a, you know, we weren't talking about gays and lesbians. We weren't talking about, I mean, it's now that we're rereading Pauli Murray and we're saying, was Pauli Murray transgender? Right, and so, I mean... And we're centering folks like Baird Russ into this conversation, Ella Baker to this conversation. Right. So, you know, I mean, this movement is building on that. And so I think that, you know, people try to parse these differences that on the one hand aren't maybe necessarily there, right? And so, you know, maybe there's more commonalities than we think, but some of the differences are important differences, like a focus on the margin, folks on the margins of the margins. Yeah. Do you think, and I want to phrase this the right way because I think we always know that Black Lives Matter. Does the movement matter the way it did 5 or 6 years ago? Or was part of the job of it really to give us a different gaze on how to think and talk about social justice? Yeah, I think, you know, we don't see as many people marching. And it could also be that we have our eyes focused and our minds focused in 1,000 different ways right now. And so one is that we're not necessarily putting attention on some of the important changes that people are making. I think the other thing is that the movement is designed to be focused at a local level. And so there are, you know, folks here in Durham who are making sure that X millions of dollars don't go toward building a new, right? That let's put some of the money over here. There's, you know, folks in California who are preventing more prisons from being built. There are, you know, there are kids who have been inspired to work toward making sure, you know, all Virginians, whether they're documented or undocumented, to get licensed. Even, I mean, granted that the Women's March is excluding Black Lives Matter, we have to keep in mind that I'm sure they were inspired, right? That, hey, we're in a movement, we're in a moment where protest is a thing that people understand and are willing to do.
Right.
So, you know, maybe we don't see all the attention, we don't have a lot of attention, but I think that there are plenty of things that are happening. And the fact that we have a whole set of Democrats, white, now all white, who are talking about environmental racism,
right.
who are talking about reparations.
Right, and that would, and
right?
to be quite honest, the reparations conversation does not happen without
That's right.
the intervention of Black lives.
That's right. So the narrative has changed, the conversation has changed, the questions that people must answer have changed.
And I think the point that you make about the local politics is particularly insightful, because this is actually happening in a moment where local news and local press is disappearing.
That's right.
So you don't even have a local news infrastructure to cover these stories, let alone to bring a national press to these narratives.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the new book, Racial Stasis, and this idea that millennials, because they are so removed from these watershed movements, the civil rights movement and Jim Crow, that they don't actually have an analysis, right, to actually understand what structural inequality and structural racism looks like. And so in the irony of this moment where so much of that history has been documented, you now have a generation that, you know, it's an obscure history for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so, and just, I mean, to be clear, that book focuses on white millennials.
Right.
But, you know, the issue of curriculum and what folks are learning and know and don't know, you know, spans across the racial spectrum.
Right.
But I mean, we mostly just kind of find that we tend to think that young people are going to usher in, you know, all the end of racism. And, you know, the thing that we tend to forget is that, you know, we often think like, oh, this generation is going to do this. Well, it's not like that generation created themselves. They didn't just fall out of the sky. We socialize them.
Right.
We teach them or don't teach them. And so this idea that one generation is going to shift everything is asinine, because they have already picked up their parents' sensibilities.
Yeah.
Now maybe they're a little different, but they're not going to be completely divorced. And I think that's one of the things that we forget when we're trying to understand why and under what circumstances a generation might do something differently.
Are you worried, concerned, excited about what this particular presidential election cycle is going to present to America more broadly, but to the folks who really were Black Lives Matter?
That question is too hard for me to answer right now, to be honest.
That's a good answer.
To be honest, yeah. I don't, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to wrap my mind around the possibility that we might have an additional 4 years.
Right.
Not even necessarily of the Trump administration,
right,
but of the just complete disregard for institutions. And there are ones that I have critiques for, but the just sheer disregard for norms of democracy by, and not Trump, because it's like, but like Mitch McConnell.
Right.
I'm at a loss for words at the disregard for the norms of democracy.
Oh. Yeah, I think about the recent skirmish between Secretary of State and National Public Radio. And how in 2020 we actually have to be in the position to defend a free press.
Yes.
In this country, after 50 years of a critique.
Yes.
About folks who in Eastern Europe,
yes,
right, didn't allow for a free
yes.
press.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist. There's a book called On Tyranny, and it's like 20 mini chapters because the book it's small.
Right.
But one of the things, the point is that there are little things that can happen that change, that we become accustomed to.
Right. Right.
And it turns us easily, we don't even notice.
Right.
And so that's the worry that I have, is that we'll get to this, we'll be turning these norms quietly, and then we'll say, oh, okay, well, that must be normal.
And it doesn't matter who's in the White House.
That's right. That's right.
We've been joined today by Professor Candis Watts Smith, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She's the author of Black Mosaic, The Politics of Black Pan-Ethnic Identity, NYU Press 2014. The co-author with Tehama Lopez Bonyanzi, Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter, also New York University Press 2019, and the just published Racial Stasis, The Millennial Generation and the Stagnation of Racial Attitudes in American Politics, published by the University of Chicago Press. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Black lights and booze